This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian. Even if you've hardly been following the news over these past few months, you've probably heard something or other about the extreme actions the Trump administration has taken to restrict who's allowed to be in the United States and who should be excluded.
Jasmine Mooney is a Canadian citizen who had a work visa, no criminal record, and had been traveling back and forth between Canada and California without any complications until she says she was suddenly detained without explanation at the San Diego border when she tried to reapply for a new visa.
A French scientist was denied entry to the U.S. after his phone was searched and officers found text messages where he was critical of Trump.
We've now heard from the loved ones of two German tourists who say separately they've been held here at Otay Mesa Detention Center for weeks. They're questioning why they were detained at all.
To be clear, these headline-grabbing incidents are thankfully still the exception to the norm, but they've become common enough that several countries have now issued travel advisories for their citizens who plan on visiting the United States. And then there are the immigration stories.
In open defiance of a federal court order, the Trump administration deported more than 200 Venezuelan migrants from the U.S. to El Salvador.
The Department of Homeland Security announcing it is revoking the temporary protected status of hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. This new order applies to just over 500,000 people fleeing countries facing war and political instability.
The administration has revoked the visas of dozens of international students, making them ineligible to remain here in the U.S. and finish their studies.
Back in October, on the eve of his inauguration, Trump held a giant political rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City. And one of the warm-up speakers was his soon-to-be political advisor, Stephen Miller. In a fiery speech, Miller expressed what would soon become the through line of the country's new anti-immigration policy.
America is for Americans and Americans only.
But the United States has always had a reputation of attracting people of all races, religions, and ethnicities from around the world. So what exactly is an American? And actually, why should any of this even matter? I mean, I know most of us live the majority of our lives confined to a small corner of the planet, but our 21st century technology, transportation, and means of communication have made this focus on nationality seem less and less relevant. Besides, with so many of the challenges we face nowadays, like pollution, climate change, and pandemics, man-made geopolitical borders are so often meaningless because the forces of nature certainly don't respect them. Therefore, I know this might sound sort of radical, but if it ever made any sense, the entire concept of the nation-state just seems kind of quaint and outdated for the modern world. On today's episode, the story of one man who reached all these conclusions himself more than 75 years ago, way ahead of his time. His name was Garry Davis, and I went to interview him back in 2009 when he was 88 years old. According to my directions, Garry's house was in South Burlington, Vermont, in the United States of America, but as soon as I pulled into his driveway, I noticed a sign next to his front door proclaiming it Sovereign World Territory.
Hey, it's good to meet you. Sorry, I'm running a few minutes behind here.
He came up to me, pointed out that I was standing on planet Earth, and asked me to present my World Citizen card. I didn't have one, so thankfully he decided to waive the requirement. Then he led me into his living room where we'd sit for the next 5 hours, talking about a choice he made when he was 26 years old in 1948. It was a simple act that took just a minute to perform, but it would make the rest of his life really complicated. Over the next 6 decades, he'd be detained and imprisoned countless times, dragged off the floor of the United Nations General Assembly, and gain millions of followers, all while confronting bureaucrats who had absolutely no idea what to do with him. What set this chain of events into motion was Garry's decision to stand before a guy in a gray suit at the U.S. Embassy in Paris, put his hand on a Bible, and read a couple of lines off a sheet of paper.
I hereby swear that I desire to make a formal renunciation of my American nationality, and pursuant thereto, hereby absolutely and entirely renounce my nationality in the United States and all rights and privileges thereunto, and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to the United States of America.
Garry's life journey that led him up to that point was pretty unexpected. You see, growing up in the 1930s and 40s, he had a lot going for him. He was born into privilege to a wealthy Philadelphia family whose car was a chauffeured Rolls-Royce. His father, Garry Davis, was a famous band leader at the time. This is his orchestra you're hearing right now. Family friends included Ethel Merman and Bob Hope. As a young man, Garry was a rising Broadway star who once performed as an understudy to the famous actor Danny Kaye. Then came World War II. Garry was drafted into the Army Air Force and trained to pilot a B-17 bomber. The experience had a profound impact on him.
That was a whole reassessment of my role in life. How dared they put me in this role? How humiliating to my soul, my moral character, my profession. Everything you learn in kindergarten is being thrust aside, and now you're a killer in the name of the nation. But you're not prepared for that. You're not prepared to even think about that. There's no education for that. At least it wasn't for me.
Flying bombing raids over Brandenburg and losing his older brother Bud to a German torpedo caused him to reevaluate not just his participation in the war, but his identity as an American citizen.
I said, there is something intrinsically wrong with society, and I'm not going to play this game anymore. So that started me on a whole wave of thinking about how not to play the game. Without going to a desert island, and canceling out.
He started reading about philosophy and history and studying the law. Eventually, he concluded that the only way to prevent future wars was for people to remove themselves from the system that creates the us versus them mentality. So, after a year of planning and strategizing, Garry decided to act.
I walked into the U.S. Embassy on May 25th, 1948, and I asked to renounce my nationality. Well, everybody was appalled, of course. We're here to protect you. I said, no, you can't protect me. You didn't protect my brother, and you didn't protect anybody outside that I killed, and so forth. So finally, I convinced them.
The U.S. State Department says just a few thousand Americans a year give up their citizenship. So Garry's action was kind of unusual to begin with. What made it even stranger was that he wasn't becoming a citizen of any other country.
They said, okay, Mr. Davis, now you're a stateless person. And you have something that belongs to us. I said, what was that? The United States passport. Please give it to us. So then the fun began.
Garry left the embassy and went to the local office of the Associated Press to tell his story to the world. Then he went back to his hotel room to try to get some rest, but word had gotten out, so the phone began ringing constantly. First it was United Press, then Reuters, then the International News Service, all asking him for interviews. As I sat in Garry's living room listening to his stories, I asked him to show me his scrapbook of press clippings from the days that followed.
These are U.S. stories. Philadelphia News, May 27th, 1948. This went all over the press.
What does this headline here say?
Young citizen of nowhere must live there, too. See, the journalists had a lot of fun with me. I mean, here was a big story. It was unique. It was personal. It was political. It was active. The guy was on the line himself. It wasn't just a theory.
Did people see it as a publicity stunt?
The publicity stunt didn't come into play simply because of the renunciation. This guy's giving up United States citizenship. That's not a publicity stunt. It threw in a counterlight the so-called theory that everybody wanted to be a United States citizen. Everybody was trying to get into the United States after the war. Here's a guy who gives up his United States citizenship. What is he? Is he a crackpot? Is he a clown? What's his motivation, in other words? We want to find out more of who he is and what his real reasons are.
Garry attempted to answer some of these questions by releasing a statement explaining his action.
In the absence of an international government, our world politically is now a naked anarchy. 2 global wars have shown that as long as 2 or more powerful sovereign nation states regard their own national law as supreme and sufficient to handle affairs between nations, there can be no order on a planetary level. This international anarchy is moving swiftly toward a final war. I no longer find it compatible with my inner convictions to contribute to this anarchy. and thus be a party to the inevitable annihilation of our civilization by remaining solely loyal to one of these sovereign nation states. I should like to consider myself a citizen of the world.
To be clear, this wasn't an entirely new or original concept. Many notable individuals throughout history, including Socrates, Charlie Chaplin, and more recently Barack Obama, have called themselves world citizens. But Garry took this idea to another level. For the rest of his life, he'd be a free agent operating by his own set of rules and without any sort of roadmap or instruction manual.
Being neutral, my position was outside the framework of the laws of the nations. It was very exciting. Wondering what's going to happen now. What's the French government going to say?
The answer came quickly. Given that he was now undocumented, French officials gave him a deadline to get out. But without a passport, where could he go? Traveling anywhere was sure to be difficult, but just as Garry was considering his options, he had a stroke of luck.
The day that I was supposed to be out of France was September 11th, 1948. That was the day that the General Assembly of the United Nations took over a little part of Paris at the Trocadero, and it was declared international territory. It was the only place I could go, actually, without going to jail or without going to another nation and facing the same problem that I faced in France. So I went to the United Nations. I made a press statement saying, I'm your first citizen. I have to live here.
Garry and some friends camped out on the front steps, calling for world citizenship as a path to lasting peace, something the UN's predecessor, the League of Nations, had failed to uphold. Officials didn't know quite what to do with them. Then, that November, Garry managed to gain access to one of the General Assembly's meetings, and he used the opportunity to draw attention to his cause.
An incident that reflects the mood of an impatient world interrupts proceedings at the United Nations Assembly.
All the press was there, and we had huge lights, and we had the balcony box wired up so that it could take our speech.
I interrupt.
All the delegates were on the floor. Eleanor Roosevelt, with their headphones, they were wondering where this voice is coming from.
Mr. Wyszynski looks on as the interrupter, Garry Davis, self-styled first citizen of the world, is hustled out.
Speak to the people. Shall I speak? Will you let me?
I said, I interrupt in the name of the people not represented here. The nations you represent divide us, separate us, and lead us to the abyss of World War III. What we need is one government for one world. And if you don't do it, step aside. We're going to do it ourselves. We had screaming headlines the next day.
Those headlines were seen by people around the world. Authors and intellectuals like Richard Wright, Albert Camus, and even Albert Einstein spoke out on Davis's behalf, and he began receiving letters from supporters near and far. Remember, the war had just recently ended, and memories of the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust were still fresh in people's minds, especially there in Europe, so folks were eager to hear what Garry had to say. Less than 2 weeks after his storming of the UN, he gave a speech in a Paris auditorium, and 20,000 people showed up. Many of them expressed interest in his movement, so he got to work creating something they could actually join.
Pendant ce temps, dans un hôtel parisien, le citoyen du monde, Garry Davis, s'organise.
We set up a registry of world citizens. We hired a hall, and we started issuing a world citizen card. And that was the first thing. We were IDing a whole new constituency, a world constituency. It was a new language.
More after this.
Europe is a complicated place. A lot of politics, a lot of languages, and a lot of different cultures crammed onto one continent.
The Europeans is an award-winning weekly podcast that makes sense of European news while managing to have fun at the same time. We bring you deep dives into European stories you might not have heard about.
Real assets are things that have physical substance.
Real assets.
Real assets. Sounds kind of funny.
Wait, Dominic, you're suggesting it sounds kind of sexy?
Yeah, because people talk about your assets. Was that not the direction I was meant to go in?
I didn't see that coming at all.
plus in-depth interviews with fascinating Europeans.
What does it mean to be black in Europe? Can you build a community around that?
The Europeans, new episodes every Thursday. Find us wherever you're listening to this.
Though Garry Davis no longer had a nationality, he still considered New York his home. So he returned to the U.S. Embassy and managed to convince authorities to let him migrate back to his native land. After arriving, he got married, had a kid, went back to acting, and tried returning to his pre-war life, but his heart just wasn't into it.
I was making good money in show business, and I had so many offers, and I gave it all up. I left the top show in Broadway after 3 days of rehearsal, and I told the producer, "I'm sorry, Horace, I can't be in this show because I got to work for world peace."
Unsure of what to do next, he struggled with how to navigate life as a stateless individual.
So I went to the top civil rights lawyer in New York. I told him, I said, "I'm not a citizen here. I'm not an immigrant. I'm not a visitor. What is my status?" And they had a full staff meeting on that. And they said, "You're not really here. Legally, you're not here. Physically, you're here. And the government has recognized you physically. Therefore, not being within the framework of the United States law, you have been recognized by the United States government as a sovereign, like the Iroquois Indians. So you've got nationhood within you. You call yourself a world citizen, and you have all these people out there as world citizens. How can you be a citizen without a government?" They said, "You got to declare your government. Once you declare the world government, then you can do a lot of things. First of all, you can issue your own documents, your own money. You can declare war on the United States, and then the United States will beat you, and then it has to take care of you for the rest of your life." They had a field day. These were lawyers kind of having fun. This was a new problem, which they never had.
Garry gave this some thought and decided to follow their advice. On September 4th, 1953, he formalized that registry of supporters he had created while he was in Paris and founded the World Government of World Citizens. He opened an office in New York and hired some staff and interns to carry out the day-to-day running of the government via a nonprofit organization called the World Service Authority. And they started issuing documents including birth and marriage certificates, international residence permits, and political asylum cards for people who contacted them requesting help. So at this point, I had to ask Garry the question that's probably on your mind right now, which is some variation of, can they do that? I mean, here you have this guy who decided he wants to form a new government that anyone can join, and he's printing official-looking credentials for people to present to border guards and bureaucrats. Were these documents actually legitimate?
Well, is the United States legitimate? Is war legitimate? Turn it around, the question around. Who is to say what is legitimate? Is not my claiming to be who I am legitimate? If you're on a desert island alone, are you legitimate? You're the government, you're the citizenry, you're alone. Do whatever you want. But you see me coming along in a raft, and you say, well, we're together now, we form a community, then we legitimize the community. How do governments start in the first place? They don't start with governors. Government started by people deciding to have a government, to legitimize themselves within a community.
But enough with the philosophizing. From a legal perspective, Garry told me that yes, he believed the work of his new world government was entirely legitimate because it was based on the Articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a UN document describing the rights and freedoms of all people.
Now, the first article that we've taken is the Article 13, Section 2, which is an article on freedom of travel, which says everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. But what is a country? Tom Paine said, "My country is the world." And when you think that you can get around the world in 2 days today, you can say, well, really, the world is a country at this point. So we need a document based upon freedom of travel.
Hence the creation of the World Passport, printed in 7 languages, including the made-up universal language of Esperanto.
So it's made to look like any other passport typically issued by a nation-state that someone would have.
Yeah. It's a document which they can look at, and it IDs you completely. But it's just not a national passport. This is all important for the guy on the frontier, because this is the way they operate. You see, it's for him. It's not for us. We don't believe in passports. We think they're stupid. In fact, many times I say, look, our passport is a joke. It's a joke on them, whereas your passport, your national passport's a joke on you.
Garry said he thinks the whole process of making someone get a stamp in a little book in order to cross an imaginary border is really dumb. But by creating his own passport, he was basically thumbing his nose at the establishment and saying, see, I could play this game too. Now, in case you're thinking that Garry just started the world government as a form of political theater, I should explain that he saw his organization as serving a real need. You see, many of the letters he and his colleagues received, especially in those early days, came from refugees who were stateless themselves. But unlike Garry, they didn't choose to end up that way.
They needed a document to say who they were. They couldn't get it from the nation. There are huge refugee camps outside of Djibouti or in the Sudan and so forth, and the people are families living under tents in the heat. Now, the United Nations is not issuing them documents, but the World Service Authority is.
And believe it or not, these passports and other documents that Garry and his team of ragtag visionaries created actually worked some of the time. Garry told me the story, for example, about the time members of the Ogoni tribe from southern Nigeria reached out asking for help. After protesting the Shell Oil Company's environmental destruction of their land, they had to flee across the border to a refugee camp in the neighboring country of Benin. They didn't have any identity documents, though, so the world government made passports for more than 100 of them, which they were then able to use to obtain visas to get out. There was also the young conscientious objector who successfully avoided registering for the draft through some clever letter writing, claiming that his citizenship in the world government forbade him from joining the American military. And the woman in Uganda caught in a bind when her country's dictator decided to expel her and other members of the country's Indian minority.
We received an urgent telegram saying that one of the mothers, the Indian mothers, had given birth at Uganda airport. So what the baby needed was an immediate birth certificate because they were going to be picked up the next day by a British plane. And I got on the typewriter, wrote out the first world birth certificate, and went to a stationery store and put a seal on it and so forth. And I got it in the mail at 5 o'clock and it got down to that airport the next day. And the plane came in. The captain of the plane said, "Where's the baby's documents? We can't take anybody without documents." And the mother handed him the document that I had just typed out on my typewriter. Well, the baby was in the mother's arms, of course. So the captain accepted that. He had to accept that. And the plane flew to Heathrow. And that was the document upon which that baby got into UK with the mother.
In the decades that followed, the world government has continued its work, issuing more than 5 million legal documents, including over 850,000 passports. And according to copies of passport stamps and visas people have sent them, they say nearly every country in the world has accepted those passports for travel on at least a few occasions. But it's unclear how many of those were cases where authorities genuinely believed in the validity of the documents versus situations where perhaps the border guards simply weren't paying close attention to the pieces of paper in front of them. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that for every instance where people have had success using these documents, there are many other times when they haven't worked as intended. In one of the most high-profile cases, rapper Yasin Bey, formerly known as Mos Def, tried to leave South Africa with a world passport in 2016, and he was arrested and charged with using a document not issued by a lawful authority. Some critics have charged over the years that the world government is in the business of selling false hope to undocumented individuals, given that the legal recognition and acceptance of world passports and ID cards is unpredictable and by no means guaranteed. But an organization's spokesman said that simply providing people with papers gives them some degree of human dignity. Garry, for his part, had little sympathy for anyone who said his documents, like the world passport, were little more than novelty items.
Does it work? You know, I have to say to you, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I work. I'm the citizen. The documents do nothing. It's a tool. A hammer does nothing unless you pick it up and know how to use it. My consciousness works, and I'm conscious of who I am. That's the only thing that works. We say that to everybody who calls us. We're not doing anything really except giving testament to who you are.
In other words, he said people can't simply present a world passport at a national border and expect to breeze through immigration the way they might with a national passport. They need to stand up for their rights and know the right things to say to convince the border guard to let them through.
Did you claim to be a world citizen? Do you know anything about the Declaration of Human Rights? Have you read any of my books? You know, you're on that front line. You're the guy who gets out there and talks to these idiot officials. If you haven't learned how to talk back to them, then they're going to put you down. They're going to humiliate you every time. Then you're going to write to me or call me and say, I paid for that passport and it doesn't work. When people say your passport doesn't work, you say, well, I went to India with the first passport, number 00001. And I left India 3 months later with 17 visas on my first passport. Don't tell me that passport doesn't work.
But even Garry, who's well-versed in international law and has all the best legal arguments at his disposal, had mixed success. Over the years, by his own account, he was imprisoned 34 times in 9 different countries when officials didn't accept his documents. Now, this is the part of the story where I should tell you that when I first learned about Garry Davis a number of years ago, I was intrigued. So I actually sent away for one of his world passports, but it's been sitting in a drawer ever since, and I've never tried using it myself. Because, I'll be honest, while I really appreciate the concept of a world without borders, I'm not an activist for the cause. I mean, it's not something that I feel so strongly about that I'd be willing to risk being detained for hours or even days in some foreign country's airport and missing my flight. When I'm traveling, I usually just want to get to my final destination without engaging in political and philosophical arguments with border guards along the way. I mentioned to Garry that I had one of his passports but never used it, and he called me a coward. I understand why he sees it that way, because for him, this was a cause worth devoting his life to.
I've taken my case up to the Supreme Court. They didn't hear the case, but when the Supreme Court denies your writ, that means the lower court decisions prevail. But all the lower court decisions were that I was an excludable alien, but they couldn't exclude me.
There's nowhere they could send you to.
There's nowhere they could send me.
So Garry was basically in a stalemate with the U.S. government, living out his life in his humble home there in South Burlington, Vermont, despite existing in a sort of legal limbo.
One journalist went to the immigration department. She asked, what is Garry Davis' status? And his answer was, Garry Davis is a legal fiction. That means I don't exist. If that's not proof of the power of an individual, that according to the United States, according to all the nation states, you claim to be a world citizen, you become a legal fiction that they can't deal with you. But you're still existent.
In addition to issuing passports, birth certificates, and ID cards, Garry's world government has created a legal department to provide support for document holders whose paperwork is denied. They've established a sovereign order of world guards that anyone can join, and they've even printed their own stamps and world money.
This is our world treasury here.
He pulled out a box.
As a world citizen, I decided that we need a new currency. The currency is called the Mondo, M-O-N-D-O. And this money is based upon energy. Where is the greatest source of energy? It's the sun, obviously. Buckminster Fuller says there's more energy poured on the earth by the sun in 5 minutes than humanity uses all year. These are kilowatt dollars. This is a peace currency. You can't fight wars with it. So look at the immediate trust that it'll have. I get a lot of letters for people to donate money. I always put this money in, and I explain it with a sheet. This is world money. You want a donation from a world citizen? This is what you're going to get. Now, I haven't gone into the markets and started using it at this point, but that'll come.
Garry passed away in 2013 at the age of 91, and he was active until the end. Shortly before his death, he mailed a world government passport to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange when he was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and also to fugitive national security contractor Edward Snowden, who's been living in Russia since his U.S. passport had been revoked. Garry Davis's view of political boundaries was not that they shouldn't exist, but rather that they don't exist. He said they're a legal fiction we've all come to believe in, and by placing himself outside the realm of the nation-state, he'd thereby rendered them obsolete. For Garry, the idea of world government was not some far-out utopian vision, but rather an idea rooted in pragmatism. He said we're all world citizens, but it's up to each of us whether we want to recognize that fact. When I first met Garry at his home there in Vermont, he told me about a recent trip he had taken to visit his kids who lived in Montreal. Coming back, he arrived at the U.S. border, as usual, with only his world government passport. At first, immigration refused to let him pass. It was the same bureaucratic showdown he'd faced many times over the years. Garry told them that their borders were ridiculous. He said that the sun shined the same on both sides of their imaginary line, and that he was just going from one part of the world to another. Eventually, they relented. Get out of here, they said. Go home. If you found this story interesting, you could check out my show notes, where I've linked to videos of Garry Davis and more information about the world government. And as always, please leave a rating or review for Far From Home wherever you listen to podcasts, and help spread the word to anyone who you think might enjoy this show. I should also mention that I produced shorter versions of this story many years ago for several other programs. So thanks so much to my editors, Tamara Keith at B-Side Radio and Jess Engerbretson at Backstory Radio, for helping me with those initial rounds of edits. Remember, you could follow Far From Home on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm also now on Blue Sky. I'm just getting started on the platform, but I'd love to have you join me there. Until next time, I'm Scott Gurian. Thanks for listening.